He was born in a sharecropper's shack, watched his parents get divorced at age 2, dropped out of high school and suffered poverty so much that he had to lie to get a loan of $500. Yet from that loan, George Ellis Johnson and his wife would build the first black-owned firm on Wall Street, a company so prosperous that Martin Luther King Jr. publicly called it Black Power. So how did a $500 lie to a bank grow into a $40 million business, and how did his children tear it apart? This is the incredible rise and tragic fall of Johnson Products. Born from nothing. On June 12, 1927, in a 3-room sharecropper shack in Mississippi, George Ellis Johnson was born. Living conditions were abysmal, and the cost of staying alive left no room for anything beyond survival. Yet life would only get harder from there, as just 2 years after he was born, his parents decided to separate, and his mother Priscilla packed up what little she had and moved with him to Chicago. There she was able to find work that paid $16 a week, and with that, she was able to raise her son largely alone. But that wasn't all. Thanks to bad living conditions, George had to live like an adult from the get-go, earning money almost as soon as he could carry anything. His job at 6 was collecting scrap paper and bottles with his brother to sell to the junkmen for pennies. By 8 years old, he was shining shoes outside Doolittle Elementary School, and by his teenage years, he was working as a busboy during the day and setting pins at a bowling alley at night as the months passed. When Johnson got old enough, he enrolled at Wendell Phillips High School, met an intelligent young woman named Joan Henderson, who would become his future wife, and then dropped out before finishing because schooling took more than anything the job market offered. Then in 1944, at 17 years old, he took a job as a production chemist at a cosmetics company owned by Samuel B. Fuller, mostly known back then as the richest black man in America. Samuel Fuller did not just teach Johnson chemistry, yet somewhere in those labs mixing formulas meant to ease the daily pain of black hair care, George Johnson found the outline of the rest of his life. Fuller had built his fortune as a way to create lasting wealth on Chicago's South Side rather than simply to get rich. Johnson seemed to adopt that mindset, and by the time he was 25, he was married to Joan, raising 2 young children, and working 3 separate jobs at once just to stay afloat. Yet little did he know that the next stranger he'd meet in an elevator would change his life. And that stranger was a barber named Orville Nelson. The strange $500 vacation. Johnson stepped onto the elevator at Fuller's office looking tired and defeated. He had just asked Fuller for help creating a relaxer that would not burn his clients' scalps, and Fuller had turned him away without a second thought. Johnson blurted out a question before he could stop himself, asking Nelson what was wrong, and within months the 2 men had built a working formula together using what Johnson had learned on Fuller's payroll. But there was one major issue that had to be dealt with. They needed money, a lot of it. Johnson, seeing no other way forward, walked into a Chicago bank and asked for $250 to start a hair care business. Right in his face, the request was turned down flat. So after 3 days of thinking about what to do, he walked into a different branch and asked for the same amount. However, there was one caveat. This time, he said he needed the money for a family vacation to California, and to his surprise, the loan was approved. He combined it with the $250 he had been saving up, bringing the total to $500. And with that money, he bought bottles, labels, and ingredients. And after buying everything he had in mind, Johnson had exactly $1 left over. They called the product Ultra Wave Hair Culture, and Johnson and Joan sold it out of the back of a station wagon, driving it barbershop to barbershop across Chicago and into Harlem. This was easy. They built a customer base 1 chair at a time, albeit at the cost of his partnership with Nelson. The relationship did not survive the company's early success, as Nelson began to secretly sell his own version of the formula without telling Johnson. This was the betrayal that ended everything. And just like that, the relationship between the 2 men who had built the product together fell apart long before the business they started as a team even had a solid brand to work with. So George and Joan kept going without him. And thanks to the couple's hard work, Johnson Products Company was incorporated in 1954, with George as the public face and Joan running the books, the billing, and the day-to-day operations. That kept the lights on while her husband was on the road chasing the next sale. Joan was far from a quiet partner, as she had grown up on Chicago's South Side, and would eventually sit on the board of the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art and as a trustee at Spelman College, funding scholarships for thousands of aspiring students she'd never meet. As for the family business, their success was just beginning. Ultra Sheen, Afro Sheen, and Wall Street. Ultra Wave at the time had been built for men, but Joan saw something bigger. In 1957, George's wife Joan rebranded the formula as Ultra Sheen, a hair straightener now marketed directly to women that could be applied safely at home instead of requiring hours in a salon chair. And within a few years, it had eclipsed Ultra Wave entirely. Sales crossed $1 million by 1964, climbed to $4 million by 1967, and reached $12 million by 1970. To meet up with demand, the company had to move into a new 30,000-square-foot headquarters on Chicago's South Side. Many things about this property stood out at the time. For one, the massive scale of the area was the kind of thing nobody expected a black-owned hair care company to be able to afford. Not only was the property expensive, but the interiors were all filled with original artwork from ancient African sculptures to Herman Miller furniture. It didn't take long for the place to begin to function like a tourist attraction, bringing in the attention of big names like Martin Luther King Jr. When he toured that building in 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. toured that building, looked up at Johnson standing on the second-floor balcony, and told the room, "Now this is Black Power?" Then, at the company's cafeteria, he announced the creation of Operation Breadbasket, an initiative that would become the economic arm of the civil rights movement, and it was established inside a building where roughly 90% of the staff was black. It was just 5 years earlier, when the company was barely 7 years old, when Johnson had thrown a hairdresser appreciation dinner and booked Louis Armstrong as the entertainment. It was a level of glamour nobody expected from a hair relaxer company still new to the industry. Then 2 years before going fully public, Johnson had already raised $5.7 million in a limited stock offering. So when Johnson Products listed on the American Stock Exchange in 1971, it became the first black-owned company in American history on a major exchange. The deal earned him an additional $10.2 million in his private account. Yet the records didn't stop there. That same year, George Johnson became the first black American elected to the board of Commonwealth Edison, one of the largest utility companies in the country. It was just 7 years earlier, in 1964, when he and a few others founded Independence Bank. What he didn't anticipate was that this institution would go on to become the largest black-owned bank in the United States. Inside the company, Johnson built a workplace almost nobody else in the industry offered black employees at the time. Among the many benefits offered to workers were full health insurance, paid sick leave, maternity leave, college tuition reimbursement, and a profit-sharing program. When later asked about how he thought about workers' benefits in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he said giving employees the most the company could afford was the golden rule applied to a payroll. But even that wasn't the biggest cultural shift for working black Americans at the time. As the Black Power movement spread through the late 1960s and natural hair became a statement of pride rather than something to straighten away, Johnson developed a game-changer called Afro Sheen. This was a styling line built for hair worn the way it grew naturally, and he backed it with advertising from Vince Colors that showed black men and women as doctors, pilots, and professionals at a time when almost no other company in America was putting those images on television. By 1971, Johnson Products had also become the exclusive national sponsor of a local Los Angeles dance show called Soul Train, making Johnson the first black-owned company to sponsor a nationally broadcast television program. At its peak, the company controlled close to 80% of the black hair care market and employed more than 500 people across operations that stretched as far as Africa, the West Indies, and Latin America. But, as we'll see, not everyone was happy with this, and what happened after would mark the beginning of the end. The systemic attacks on Johnson's company. Success this large always invites a correction from health agencies and legal authorities, and for Johnson Products, it arrived from two directions at once. The first began in 1975 when the Federal Trade Commission ordered Johnson Products specifically, rather than the entire industry, to place lie content warning labels on its relaxer line. This order was a very big deal, especially because this line was more than half the company's total sales. Worse yet, this happened at a time when Revlon, a much larger competitor, was entering the same black hair care market. And for some reason, it was not held to the same immediate standard as Johnson's company. George Johnson called the order a real, deliberate assassination of Ultrasheen, and the numbers backed up his reasons for being angry at it. And what happened afterwards would be the massive trigger for the tragic fall of Johnson's company. To start with, the annual sales, which had reached $40 million by 1976, would freeze at that level for most of the next decade, while competitors kept multiplying within the industry. Revlon kept expanding its reach into the category with deeper pockets than any black-owned firm could match. Soft Sheen, a black-owned rival just a few miles away in Chicago, exploded in size on the back of the Jerry curl trend and eventually outgrew Johnson products entirely. A manufacturing operation Johnson had built in Nigeria, meant to be a symbol of global ambition, instead became a drain on resources and management attention that the company could not easily absorb. The brand that had once dominated black hair care like a single name owning an entire supermarket aisle now found itself fighting for shelf space against rivals who were faster and unburdened by the regulatory weight that had landed on Johnson alone. Years later, a documentary called No Lie would tell about this, the rise and slow unraveling of an entire line of black-owned beauty companies, with Johnson products as one of its cases. Yet a bigger problem was brewing from within the family. The divorce that ended everything. Many were surprised in 1989 when, after almost 40 years of marriage and building a company from nothing into one of the largest black-owned businesses in America, George and Joan Johnson divorced. To avoid a public courtroom fight that could have handed the company to outside creditors or forced a sale just to keep the lawyers paid, they tried their best to keep things private. So to everyone's shock, George Johnson did the unexpected. It was a decision meant to protect what they had built together, yet it involved transferring most of his shares to Joan, leaving her with over 60% ownership and full control as the firm's chairman, while he stepped back from day-to-day leadership entirely. One question came to people's minds when the news broke out. Why did he choose to do it this way? The evidence suggests that it was a calculated trade rather than a surrender, and the result was a protected brand that was still the first black-owned company on Wall Street, even though it meant the man who built that distinction would no longer run the company that earned it. But it would still be run by a person of color, and better yet, by the woman he trusted the most. However, there were significant problems to deal with. The company he handed her was not the empire of a decade earlier. Stock that had once represented millions in family wealth was now trading at around $2 a share. Their eldest son, Eric Johnson, stepped into the role of president and chief executive at just 37 years old, inheriting a business that needed saving more than it needed steering. Eric moved fast, and by late 1989, he engineered the $5 million acquisition of a competitor, M&M Products, a deal that added $9 million in annual sales and paid for itself within 18 months. Profits climbed 50% to $3.2 million under his leadership, and for a brief moment, it looked like the son might be the one to bring the company all the way back from the regulatory hit and the competitive bleeding of the previous decade. But it only got worse. Siblings at war. The moment of calm was just the peace before the storm, because in early 1991, Eric's younger sister, Joan M. Johnson, 27 years old and fresh off an MBA, quickly joined the family business as head of market research. But wanted more than a research title. She was overly ambitious, and she was to a fault. She not only wanted authority over one huge department, even though her brother had spent 2 years of hard work to make the company profitable again, but she also wanted to take it all. So the two siblings clashed many times. One believed she had what it took to do things better than her brother. The other thought his sister was high off getting a huge degree and had no idea how to practically handle the problems of the company. Their mother, who now controlled the majority of the stock, found herself standing between her two children, and when she finally chose a side, to the son's shock, she chose the sister. So on March 9, 1992, with no warning to the public, Johnson Products announced that Eric Johnson had resigned as president and chief executive. The company's official statement said he was leaving to pursue personal interests. Eric later admitted the truth was closer to fear, saying it was frightening to feel himself being pushed towards something that was not running Johnson Products after an earlier attempt to buy the company outright and take it private had failed. He walked away from a business posting $41 million in annual sales and $3.7 million in profit, with a severance package that could reach $600,000 plus bonus. In his place, the company created a 4-person office of the president, and Joan M. Johnson, the sister who had pushed for more power barely a year earlier, was given one of those 4 seats. Would the younger Joan have what it takes to run it better than her brother? Selling out to white competitors. Joan B. Johnson stabilized the company after her son's departure and, in 1993, made the decision that would define the rest of the Johnson product story. She sold the company to IVAX Corporation. It was a Miami-based generic drug and cosmetics firm, and the transaction was done in a stock swap valued at $67 million. Johnson Products had been the first Black-owned company ever listed on a stock exchange. But thanks to Joan's decision, it had also become the first major Black-owned hair care manufacturer in the high rankings to be sold outright to a company with no Black ownership at all. Black Enterprise magazine ran a cover story asking the simple but uncomfortable question: should Black businesses be sold to whites? Joan herself tried to answer this by defending the deal publicly as one that created real marketing synergies for the brand going forward. Her own son Eric would later support this decision, describing more bluntly how it was a smart and calculated business decision rather than a betrayal, even if it ended nearly 40 years of Black ownership with a single signature. Within the following decade, competitors like Soft Sheen and Proline would face the same pressures and reach the same conclusion, selling to larger companies for many of the same underlying reasons: family conflict, succession battles, and capital that Black-owned firms simply could not match on their own. One analyst later summarized the pattern across all 3 companies, that, in every case, it was family situations that finally forced the sale. The years after the IVAC sale read like a chain of custody rather than a business plan. The brand moved through ownership changes until it landed inside Procter & Gamble's massive portfolio in 2004, folded in through P&G's acquisition of Wella, the company that had picked up the Johnson lines along the way. Under P&G, Ultra Sheen and Afro Sheen were no longer flagship products fighting for attention. They were a small, non-strategic line inside one of the largest consumer goods companies on Earth, and annual sales drifted down to around $23 million. This was just a fraction of what the brand had once generated at its peak nearly 2 decades earlier. Then in March of 2009, the company found its way back. It was a husband and wife team, Eric Brown and Renee Cottrell Brown, the daughter of Proline founder Comer Cottrell. And they partnered with private equity firms Rustic Canyon and St. Cloud Capital to buy Johnson products back from Procter & Gamble for more than $30 million through a venture called RCJP Acquisition. For the first time in 16 years, the company that had broken the color barrier on Wall Street was Black-owned. Again, even if almost none of the people running it now shared the Johnson name. Headquarters moved to Dallas. By 2012, Eric Brown stepped back into an executive chairman role, and financier Gabrielle Green took over as chief executive, continuing a work that, though well-intentioned, had nothing to do with the family whose name was still printed on every bottle. Years later, Joan remarried George. Joan Johnson died on September 6, 2019, at their home in Chicago. She was 89 years old, and her demise came after being treated for heart and lung disease, survived by George and their children Eric, Joan, John, and George Jr. A longtime friend, businesswoman Linda Johnson Rice, called her a grande dame in every sense of the word, dignified, sharp-witted, and fun, and was careful to note that the Johnson family of hair care had no relation to the separate Johnson family behind Ebony and Jet, a mix-up people made constantly during both families' rise. In 2022, 3 years after losing the woman he had built an empire with, being divorced, losing control of a company to, and ultimately finding his way back to, he married art consultant Madeline Murphy Rabb. In February of 2025, at 97 years old, George Johnson published his own memoir, Afro Sheen, finally putting his version of events on the page. The loan he lied about, the partner he lost, the marriage that ended and somehow did not, the children who fought each other for control of what he built, and the company that changed hands 5 separate times before any version of it found something close to stability again. His Chicago office today is lined with photographs that trace exactly how far the journey went. Johnson with Barack Obama, Johnson with the Clintons and his close friend Jesse Jackson, Johnson with Muhammad Ali, Johnson with Oprah Winfrey, and underneath all of it, a framed note bearing Martin Luther King's own words from that factory visit decades earlier. Here is one question worth sitting with. When we have a powerful business empire that survived a corporate meltdown, but it could not survive an overambitious sister, was it the family's fault the company crumbled? Or was it due to external factors alone? Leave your answers in the comments below and subscribe to Black Status for more. Until next time, take care.